Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of some of my recent reading. I'm going to do the usual thing and go from least to most depressing. So first up, I read a collection of poetry called Acrobat by Nabaneeta Dev Sen, and most of the poems in here were translated from the Bengali by the author's daughter, which is fascinating. The book describes this poetry as being about womanhood and intimacy, which is not necessarily something I usually read about, but I was really fascinated by the added element to that having the translator be the author's daughter adds to that, just because it is such an intimate relationship in and of itself. So if you're writing poems about that kind of intimacy, it's fascinating to have that extra element added to it. And also just because you're guaranteed then essentially that the translator has a notion of what the author really sounds like, and especially because the author also wrote poetry in English, and a sampling of the poems in here are in English, so you can compare the daughter's translations and the voice that she captures to her mother's actual voice in English, which is really fascinating. So while this wasn't necessarily the style of poetry that I'm particularly interested in, the meta level, the translation piece I thought was really interesting because it essentially eliminates one of the concerns that one often has with translations, which is this translator capturing the essence in the same way that the author would if they were able to translate it themselves? And because it's such an intimate relationship, you have to think that this has to be about as close as it can get. And I think that's just really interesting in and of itself. And if you are interested in poetry about kind of daily life with a particularly feminine perspective, then here you go. It might be interesting on that level too. But I think the combination of translated pieces and not translated pieces together so that you can compare the two is just brilliant. Next up, I read Mariama's So Long a Letter. This was translated by Modupé Bodé-Thomas. This was first published in the early 80s and is a modern Senegalese classic. It takes the form of, as the title suggests, a letter. And a woman is writing a letter that is partly a reminiscence on her life to a friend. And it is at the point when her husband has died, and she goes back and discusses her youth and her marriage to her husband, and the 25 years of their regular marriage, and then the 5 years after her husband had taken a second wife, and rather than bringing the second wife into their household, had built an entirely separate household and kind of left her behind. And then as we go along, we also jump into, and then eventually we carry forward after the reminiscences end, and we see her life evolving after the husband dies, and we see things happening with one of her then adult or then teenage daughters. So it's a really interesting portrait of both this person's life and also the kind of evolving social mores over the course of their lifetime. So you have both the generic ups and downs of any one individual's life, but also the kind of currents of the passage of time and all of that. So I thought that was really interesting. It is a short little book, and it's kind of a fascinating peek at things. And I always like the element of letter writing being the framing for something like this, so I thought that was great fun. I know not everyone is a fan of that style, so just be forewarned that that's there, but yeah, good stuff. All right, now let's go to the war stuff. So first up, I have A Woman's Experiences of the Great War by Louise Mack. Louise Mack was an Australian writer who wrote for the Daily Mail. Yes, that Daily Mail. And so you may be asking yourself, were their reporters any better 110 years ago? Or 108 years ago? And the answer is no, this is definitely tabloid trash. But that's kind of fascinating. So given the title, you can guess that Louise Mack was kind of unusual in that she was a woman doing this reporting, and she was in Belgium in 1914 when the Germans were rolling in. So she is capturing that moment, and it is very sensationalized. It is very dramatic, and it's almost hilarious how you read this and think, this feels like somebody who should be writing for the Daily Mail, and she was. So a lot of the historical bits and pieces were kind of interesting. It's hilarious to me how everything has the French names. It's always Louvain rather than Leuven and Anvers and all of this. And like, why? Why? Which, I'm not the biggest fan of, but it's just hilarious. I think we associate that kind of tabloid reporting with a lot of xenophobia and racism, and she has that. And it's funny because she's talking about Germans, and that's not something that people say a lot of offensive things about these days. Brutish is the head, so round and close-cropped, resembling no other animal save the Germans. Their thick necks and incredibly thick legs, with the look of elephants. And you do think these kind of writers are still offensive just to other groups of people these days. It is hilarious. You know, do I think that this is a great and realistic statement of the early days of the First World War? No, probably not. But is this a fascinating time capsule looking at that style of reporting in those days? Absolutely. Yeah, if you have a chance to pick this up, I think it's absolutely worthwhile, but be aware that it's worthwhile as a matter of kind of external interest. So I feel almost about this like I did about the poetry. I was reading this and having a great deal of fun, but not because I think this is a great work of reportage that, you know, has come to us from 100 years ago. Yeah, no. Yeah, the Daily Mail was still the Daily Mail. It's crazy. So yeah, that was interesting. So let's get to the more heavily depressing stuff. Next up, I read a manga, Fumiyo Kouno's Town of Evening Calm, Country of Cherry Blossoms. This is a very short book and doesn't include a lot of peripheral elements that I think would have been useful for a lot of readers. So whether this works for any given reader is going to depend on how much external context they're bringing into the story, I think. This book has two parts, both of which are focused on members of the same family, but at different points in time. The first one is set in Hiroshima in 1955, and we're following a woman in her early 20s who is living with her mother and who lost most of her family in the atomic bombing and then the aftermath of it, aside from one brother who had been sent to stay with family out of town. And she is thinking about her future and trying to figure out if she has a future, because she's at a stage when people are still, even 10 years later, dying of radiation poisoning. And so that's hanging over the story. I'm not going to spoil the ending, but I do think it's telegraphed what's going to happen there. The second story is about the niece of that woman, who is the daughter of the brother who was in a different city, and she is following her father as he's going to go visit his family grave and looking at all the names that are August of 1945 and the ones that are in the years afterwards at young ages and whatnot. The one that's in 1987 doesn't have a lot of external context to it, and probably needed to have dates and city names or something underneath it. Because I think depending on how much or how little of this history you're familiar with, I think that is maybe assuming that you're going to get who the people are relative to the characters from the first story, but I don't think it was as obvious as it could have been at the beginning. So that's maybe a flaw in this. I did think the first story in particular was definitely emotionally gutting, though I know, and I had a friend who read this and was angry about it, so I am going to just say that I think if you are someone whose parents or grandparents or whatever lived under Japanese occupation and therefore don't want to hear stories about Japan and Japanese civilians as victims because you have this family trauma that you grew up with, anybody who has that kind of story may resent this because it is exclusively focused on civilians, and especially the first story when the girl, this is going to be a spoiler, so spoiler here, while she's dying, she is thinking, do the people who did this think, oh, I got another one, are they celebrating her death 10 years later? And I thought that was incredibly powerful, but I was talking to this friend of mine, and I'm not telling you her story because that's not my story to share, but I know there are people who will resent that because, you know, their dad's first memory as a 5-year-old was something horrific from being occupied. And I think that's similar to, it's like when you're reading about the Sudetenland Germans being expelled after World War II. A lot of people don't want to read about that. Similarly, for the same kind of reason, right? Civilians are not their government. And at this point, we are a long way away from all of that, but that is external to the book itself. I thought the first story was very successful. The second story I thought needed extra notes. There are notes at the end, but the book doesn't direct you to look for the end notes until you're at the end, which I think is maybe a missed opportunity. So I liked that, but as I said, a friend of mine read that and didn't, and I'm not going to say didn't like it, resented it because the history hits differently depending on your personal experiences of these things, right? So yeah, I don't know if I really needed that caveat, but it's a conversation I had in my real life. Let's get even closer in time. Let's jump forward to the 1990s. So then I read The 10th Circle of Hell by Rezak Hukanović. This was translated by Ammiel Alcalay, who is one of my favorite translators if you're looking at translations from the Balkan language. This is a memoir of the author's time in one of those infamous camps that were internationally recognized as concentration camps in the early days of the Bosnian War in 1992. So this is the 30th anniversary of the start of this war, and it seemed like an appropriate thing to be reading for that. This is uniquely depressing in a way that, I was going to say, few things are as depressing as this. It reminded me a little bit of going on the tour of the Genocide Center in Cambodia, in that you hear the same kind of stories of people torturing their old school teachers to death, and this is the same kind of thing because it is people's neighbors and, people being tortured to death and saying, what did I do to you? This was like, it is horrific, horrific stuff. And one of the interesting things is that he was at one of the camps that was famously photographed, and if you are old enough to remember this, it was in the news, and this was the first year of that war, and it went on for years, and yeah, appalling. This is horrific, but as with any memoir like this, you know that the author survived, so there is a certain hopefulness to it. I mean, I feel odd saying that because how hopeful is that really? Stylistically, the interesting thing is that it's written in the third person. And in the introduction, there's a note that basically he felt it was such a surreal experience, and that he almost felt like it had to have been happening to someone else and not to him, so he wrote it as though it was happening to someone else. So I thought that was really interesting. Yeah. I don't know how much I can say about this without saying it has some pretty graphic... It's not that things are described in such detail, it's just that the things that are happening are so graphic that it feels really like, this is something that I thought, I'll sit down and read this all at once, and like, it definitely felt like you have to walk some of this off, because how does anybody get to the stage where they think, yeah. Anyway. Yeah, so that's my depressing reading. Yes, and lest you think that my next one is going to be more uplifting, right now I'm in the middle of a How I Survived a Chinese Re-Education Camp memoir, and a history of Ukraine. So those will be depressing too. All right. Anyway, if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought. Are you reading particularly depressing things or particularly uplifting things? I'd be curious to hear that too. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.